Fix it quickly. I have to get back to work. Yes, Mar, he said, stepping inside with measured steps. As Idris worked, Ngozi paced around the living room, occasionally glancing at her watch. Fix it quickly. When he finished, I have to get back to work. He approached her to explain the issue. You have to get back to work. Her to explain the issue. Ngozi's brows furrowed. 5,000? For what? That's outrageous for such a simple job. It's the cost of the materials and labor, he said, still calm. But if it's too much? She waved him off. Fine. Eket, pay him and see him out, pipe was cracked, he said, but I've replaced the next few weeks stepped. Their paths crossed again. Ngozi's plumbing woes seemed unending, brows furrowed, and Idris became a reluctant fixture in her home. For what? Each time, she maintained her professional simple job, treating him like an inconvenience. It's the cost of the materials and labor, he said. One Sunday after service, Ngozi hosted a small lunch gathering for her friends from church. She waved him off. They were seated in her living room, discussing work. Pay him and see him out, life was cracked when Idris arrived. But I've the next to return a forgotten receipt. Ngozi crossed again. Who's that? One of her friends seemed wrinkling her nose, and Idris became a reluctant fixture in her home. Ngozi said dismissively, each time her tone she maintained such a simple job, treating him like an inconvenience. Her friends from church. She waved him off. They were seated in her living room, he said, discussing work, holding out the receipt. Him and see life was cracked when Idris arrived. But I've the next to return a forgotten receipt. Ngozi said sharply, who's that? When one of her friends' response seemed wrinkling her nose, and Idris became a reluctant fixture in her home. Ngozi returning to her guests. Each time her tone she maintained a special simple job, treating him like an inconvenience. The cost of materials and labor. Her friends laughed. One Sunday, still why are you here? China frowned. Not very Christian of you, Ngozi, as she said quietly. Ngozi shrugged it off, discussing work, holding out the receipt. And life was cracked when Idris arrived. The next to return a forgotten receipt. She said weeks later, who's that? The drama one of her friends' response seemed unending. She turned and Idris invited some of her family in her dinner. Ngozi returning to her guests. Each Ngozi joked she maintained as they discussed invasion, suggesting him like an inconvenience. The cost of materials and later. Her friends laughed. One Sunday, he wasn't wearing his overalls but a sharply tailored navy blue suit. He looked every bit the part of a polished gentleman, his presence commanding attention. Ngozi froze, her eyes narrowing as it Ngozi's mouth fell open as Idris took a seat. Over the next hour, her assumptions unraveled. Idris wasn't just a plumber. He was a successful entrepreneur with a thriving plumbing and property management company. He had worked on several projects for Apex Trust Bank, earning respect for his professionalism and business acumen. A final blow came when Mr. Shoben said, "You know, Ngozi, Idris is one of the most reliable people we work with. And such a devout Christian too. We've even partnered on some church projects." Ngozi's face flushed with shame. Christian? She had assumed, based on his name and nothing more, that Idris was a Muslim. She excused herself and fled to the restroom, her mind spinning. The days that followed to the restroom, her mind spinning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of regret and introspection. Idris's quiet dignity in the face of her behavior haunted her. She avoided him, but fate seemed determined to throw them together. One afternoon, she received a call from her church pastor. "Ngozi, we're working on a community water project, and I hear Idris is the best man for the job. Can you help coordinate with him?" Ngozi hesitated, but she knew she couldn't refuse. It was an opportunity to make amends, or at least try. Ngozi couldn't believe she was being forced to collaborate with Idris. Every time his name came up in a meeting about the church's water project, her annoyance flared. How could someone with his background play such a key role? To her, it felt like a deliberate attempt to undermine her professionalism. Their first meeting was at the church office. Idris arrived early, dressed sharply in a crisp white shirt and navy slacks. He greeted her with a polite nod, but she barely acknowledged him, keeping her eyes on the project documents spread across the table. "We'll be drilling 2 boreholes," as she began curtly. "One for the community center and another for the school. The budget is tight, so there's no room for waste. I hope you'll stick to the plan." Idris raised a brow, his calm demeanor intact. "I've reviewed the proposal. It's solid. But I noticed the equipment specified might not be durable enough for high usage at the school. I'd recommend upgrading the pumps." Ngozi cut him off. "We don't need unnecessary upgrades. Just follow the plan, Idris. I know how people like you operate, always trying to squeeze more money out of every project." The room fell silent. Idris's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he made a note in his notebook and nodded. "As you wish, Ms. Ajayi." Their interactions continued to be strained. Every suggestion Idris made was met with resistance from Ngozi. She accused him of being a hypocrite, pretending to be a humble artisan while secretly living a lavish lifestyle. "You walk around like you're just another plumber, but look at you," as she said one day during a heated discussion. "The fancy clothes, the cars, the connections. It's all so pretentious. Why not just admit you enjoy showing off?" Idris sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Ngozi, I'm not pretending to be anything. My work is my passion, and I give glory to God for my success. If you'd look beyond your assumptions, you'd see that." But Ngozi wasn't convinced. To her, Idris's calm responses felt rehearsed, as though he were trying to maintain an image. Proposal. Despite the tension, the project progressed smoothly, thanks in large part to Idris's expertise. The boreholes were completed ahead of schedule, and the community praised the church for the initiative. After the dedication ceremony, Idris approached Ngozi in the church garden, his heart pounding. He had wrestled with the decision for weeks, but finally resolved to speak his mind. "Ngozi," he began, his voice steady, "I've admired your strength and dedication since the day we met. Despite our differences, I believe we could build something meaningful together. Will you marry me?" Ngozi stared at him, utterly incredulous. "Marry you?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Idris, have you lost your mind?" "I'm serious, Ngozi," he said, his eyes sincere. "I see something special in you." "Special?" she snapped. "After everything, you think I'd marry you? A man who pretends to be humble but lives like royalty? I don't trust you, Idris. You're nothing but a hypocrite." Her words stung, but Idris held his ground. "You're judging me without truly knowing me, Ngozi. You see what you want to see." "This conversation is over," as she said sharply, walking away. The pastor's intervention. The next Sunday, Pastor Ederbeo called Ngozi into his office after service. She entered, fuming.
Much success, wealth, and humility? It's too perfect. Maybe we should ask why he's really here. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Idris's face darkened, but he remained silent. Pastor Adebayo stepped forward, his expression a mix of shock and disappointment. Ngozi, this is neither the time nor the place. No, Pastor, Idris interrupted, his voice steady but laced with hurt. Let her finish. Ngozi faltered, the weight of her own words sinking in as she met his gaze. For the first time, she saw something she hadn't noticed before: pain. The tension in the room was palpable as Idris stood silently, his calm demeanor a fragile mask for the hurt in his eyes. Ngozi's outburst had cast an awkward shadow over what should have been a joyous celebration. Pastor Adebayo opened his mouth to diffuse the situation, but before he could speak, a voice rang out from the back of the hall. Well, Idris Balogun. Still the saint, aren't you? All heads turned to see a man stride toward the front of the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive but slightly disheveled suit. His voice carried a tone of mock. He was enjoying the chaos. Idris's expression hardened as recognition flickered across his face. Deo, he said, his voice low and steady. The man stopped a few feet away, his smirk widening. I couldn't resist. It's been years, but look at you now, beloved by the community, praised by pastors. Funny how life turns out, isn't it? Ngozi, still standing, looked between Idris and the stranger, her confusion mounting. Who is this? She asked, her voice sharp. Deo turned to her, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Oh, you don't know? No. Idris, it's the perfect place, Deo snapped. You get to clear the air in front of all your adoring fans. Tell them how you abandoned me when our company hit rock bottom. How you walked away with a fortune while I was left to clean up the mess. The room buzzed with whispers. Idris closed his eyes briefly, then turned to the crowd. It's true that Deo and I were business partners, he said, his voice calm but firm. And it's also true that our company faced challenges. But I didn't abandon him. When the business failed, I used my personal funds to settle our debts. I even offered him support to start over, but he refused. That's a lie, Deo shouted, his face red with anger. You took the easy way out, Idris. You always had connections, people to bail you out. And now you're pretending to be some saint. Enough. Pastor Adebayo said, his voice booming. This is not the forum for airing grievances. Deo, if you have issues with Idris, handle them privately. Deo scoffed, turning to leave. But before he walked away, he glanced back at Ngozi. If I were you, I'd think twice before trusting this man. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, murmuring among themselves. Ngozi remained rooted to the spot, her mind racing. Had she been right all along? Was Idris hiding something? Or was this Deo simply a bitter man trying to tarnish a good reputation? Idris approached her, his face a mask of weariness. Ngozi, I'm sorry you had to see that. Deo has his version of the story, but I don't owe him, or anyone else, an explanation tonight. Ngozi crossed her arms, her defenses rising again. Don't you? He painted a very different picture of you, Idris. And frankly, I'm starting to wonder if I was right about you all along. Idris's jaw tightened, but he nodded. You're free to believe whatever you want. But if you're interested in the truth, I'm willing to share it. On one condition. Ngozi frowned. What condition? That you come to my church this Sunday, he said simply. She blinked, caught off guard. Your church? Yes, he said. I think it's time you see who I really am, not through assumptions or accusations, but through my faith. Ngozi hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to walk away and leave Idris to his carefully curated world. But another part, the part nagged by the pastor's earlier words, knew she needed answers.
Fine, she said at last.
But this doesn't mean I trust you. Idris smiled faintly. Understood. That Sunday, Ngozi arrived at a modest but vibrant church. His mother, the woman said proudly. Ngozi's eyes widened.
Oh.
It's a pleasure to meet you. The woman chuckled. Idris has a good heart, my dear. He's not perfect, but everything he does is rooted in his faith and love for others. I hope you'll see that in time. As the woman walked away, Ngozi felt a pang of guilt. Maybe she had been too quick to judge Idris. But then again, what about Deo's accusations? Ngozi wasn't sure what to expect when Idris called her that evening. His voice was calm but firm, asking her to meet him at his office. She hesitated but eventually agreed, curiosity and a nagging sense of guilt urging her forward. When she arrived, Idris was seated at his desk, his face thoughtful but somber. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm only here because I need answers," she replied, folding her arms. "You deserve them," Idris said, leaning forward. "But I need you to listen without judgment, Ngozi. Can you do that?" She nodded reluctantly. Idris took a deep breath and began. Ngozi wasn't sure what to expect when Idris called her that evening. His voice was calm but firm, asking her to meet him at his office. She hesitated but forward. When she arrived, Idris was seated at his desk. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm only here because I need answers," she replied, folding her arms. "You deserve them," Idris said, leaning forward. "But I need you to listen without judgment, Ngozi. Can you do that?" She nodded reluctantly. Idris took a deep breath and began. "Years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Aina," Idris said, his voice tinged with sadness. "We were young, deeply in love, and planning our future together. I thought we had it all: dreams, faith, and a commitment to build a life of purpose." Ngozi noticed the way his eyes softened as he spoke, but there was a shadow of pain behind them. "We started a construction firm together with my best friend, Deo," Idris continued. "The three of us were inseparable. Deo was like a brother to me, and Aina adored him. I trusted him completely, never imagining he could betray me." Ngozi leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "About a year into our engagement, things began to change. Aina became distant, and I couldn't understand why. I thought it was the stress of the business or wedding planning. But then one day, she confessed." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "She told me she'd fallen in love with Deo." Ngozi gasped. "What?" Idris nodded, his face grim. "It broke me, Ngozi, my best friend, and my fiancé. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't fight them. I let her go because I loved her and wanted her to be happy. At first, I thought I could move on," Idris continued. "But things got worse. Deo and Aina's relationship didn't last. She left him after just a few months, ran off to the United States with another man, taking a large sum of money Deo had stolen from the company." Ngozi's eyes widened. "She stole the money?" "Yes," Idris said. "Deo had funneled funds from our joint accounts to support Aina's lavish tastes, and when she left, the company was on the brink of collapse. I found out too late. He came to me, accusing me of orchestrating, of pushing Aina to betray him. It was absurd, but Deo needed someone to blame. So, he made you the villain?" Ngozi asked, her voice softer now. Idris nodded.
Exactly.
"He swore he'd make me pay, that I was the reason his life fell apart. I could have sued him for fraud and defamation, but I didn't. I knew his pain came from a place of hurt and humiliation. Instead, I took on the debt, worked tirelessly to rebuild, and eventually started over. Since then, I've been cautious, especially with matters of the heart," Idris admitted, his voice quieter now. "It's hard to trust when you've been betrayed by the people closest to you. I've poured myself into my work and my faith, hoping to find peace." He looked directly at Ngozi. "That's why I've been searching for true love, not something based on appearances or convenience, but a deep, genuine connection. I thought I'd found it in you, Ngozi." Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her emotions. "Me," she said, her voice sharp. "Why would you think that?" "Because despite your doubts, your strength and faith shine through," he said earnestly. "You're intelligent, passionate, and uncompromising. But you've built walls around your heart, just like I did after Aina. I see that in you, because I recognize it in myself." Ngozi was silent, his words striking a chord she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "But what about Deo?" she asked after a long pause. "Why haven't you cleared your name?" Idris sighed. "Because forgiveness is a cornerstone of my faith, Ngozi. I've resisted the urge to sue him because I believe revenge won't bring healing. Instead, I've tried to live in a way that honors God, trusting that the truth will prevail in time." Ngozi frowned. "But he's out there spreading lies about you. Doesn't that bother you?" "Of course it does," Idris admitted. "But I've learned that holding on to anger only poisons the soul. Deo's bitterness is his burden to carry, not mine." Ngozi sat back, her mind reeling. Idris's story had unraveled every assumption she'd made about him. He wasn't the hypocrite she'd imagined, but a man scarred by betrayal and yet still striving to live with integrity. But her resistance wasn't completely gone. "This is a lot to process," she said finally. "I can't promise anything, Idris. I need time." Idris smiled faintly. "Take all the time you need, Ngozi. I just needed you to know the truth." As she left his office that evening, a strange mix of emotions churned within her. Guilt, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite name. For the first time, Ngozi wondered if the walls she'd built around her heart were keeping her safe, or keeping her from something extraordinary. That night, after Ngozi returned home, she tossed and turned in her bed, her mind replaying Idris's revelations. When she finally drifted into sleep, the nightmare began. She was in an unfamiliar place, a vast, open field surrounded by dense trees. Idris stood in the distance, his eyes fixed on her. Without a word, he began to walk toward her. His steps quickened, and soon he was running. Panic surged through her chest, and she turned to flee, her feet pounding against the ground as she raced through the field.
"No."
"Stay away," she screamed, but Idris kept coming, his expression unreadable. Just as he was about to reach her, she stumbled and fell, waking up with a jolt. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, drenched in sweat.
"What is happening to me?"
she thought, clutching her chest. The nightmares didn't stop. Each night, the scene changed slightly. Sometimes she was in a crowded market, but the pattern remained the same. Idris was always chasing her, and she was always running. By the fifth night, Ngozi could barely sleep. The dreams were starting to feel like a message, but she couldn't decipher it. Was it her fears manifesting, or was God trying to tell her something? One Sunday night, Ngozi found herself staring at Idris across the church during service. He was speaking with a group of parishioners, his demeanor calm and kind. For the first time, she felt a twinge of guilt for how harshly she'd judged him. Her thoughts were interrupted when Pastor Adebayo approached her. "Ngozi, how are you?"
She hesitated, then sighed.
"Honestly, Pastor, I'm confused. I've been having these dreams, and they're all about Idris. I don't understand why." The pastor smiled knowingly. "Dreams can often be a reflection of our inner struggles. Perhaps you're running not from Idris, but from the possibility of love." Ngozi blinked, taken aback. I don't know." The pastor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Take your time, but don't let fear guide your decisions. If you feel it's right, talk to him. Ask him whatever you need to." That evening, Ngozi took a leap of faith. She called Idris. "Idris," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I have more questions. Would you come over tomorrow evening so we can talk?" Idris sounded surprised but agreed immediately. "Of course. What time?"
7, she said.
When Idris arrived at her home the next evening, Ngozi was a bundle of nerves. She had spent hours rehearsing what to say, but now that he was here, her words felt jumbled. Idris, ever observant, noticed her unease. "Ngozi, you don't have to be nervous," he said as he took a seat. "I'll answer any question you have. No filters, no evasions." She nodded, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "I need to understand everything, Idris. I've heard your story, but I need to know who you are beyond that. What drives you? What do you want from me?" Idris leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Ngozi, what drives me is my faith and the desire to live a life of purpose. I've seen how quickly material things can vanish, how relationships can crumble without trust and integrity. I've made mistakes, but I've learned from them. And what do you want from me? She pressed, her voice trembling. I want your heart, he said simply. But only if you're willing. I don't want to force you into anything. I want a partner who trusts me, even with my flaws. Ngozi looked away, her emotions swirling. It's not that simple, she said softly. I know it's not, Idris replied. But I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. Breaking the walls. For hours they talked. Idris shared more about his upbringing, his struggles, and his dreams for the future. Ngozi found herself laughing at his stories and marveling at his resilience. Yet, her fears lingered. Finally, she voiced the question that had been haunting her. Idris, what if this doesn't work? What if I say yes and everything falls apart? He looked at her, his gaze steady. Then we'll face it together. Relationships aren't about guarantees, Ngozi. They're about commitment and faith. And I'm willing to give both to you. Her heart ached at his sincerity, but her mind screamed caution. She knew she couldn't give him an answer yet, but for the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility of saying yes. The conversation between Idris and Ngozi was deepening, becoming more personal with every word. But just as Idris finished answering her last question, he surprised her with one of his own. Ngozi, he began, his tone gentle but firm, I've told you about my past, my pain, my mistakes, and my hopes. Now, I need to know about you. What are you running from? What's holding you back? Ngozi stiffened. My past isn't the issue here, Idris, she said quickly. Maybe not, he said, but it's part of who you are. I want to understand you fully, just as I've let you understand me. If we're going to build something real, we need to be honest with each other. Ngozi avoided his gaze, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. I can't, she said after a long pause. Not yet. Idris tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. Why not? She raised her eyes to meet his, a flicker of defiance in her gaze. Because you haven't answered everything, Idris. There are still things about you that don't make sense to me. If you want my story, you'll have to explain a few things first. Idris leaned back in his chair, intrigued.
Fair enough, he said.
What do you want to know? Ngozi took a deep breath, steadying herself. Why did you come to my house personally as a plumber? A man of your status could have easily sent one of your workers. Was it a test? Idris smiled faintly. I'll answer that, but go on. She continued, her voice gaining confidence. And why haven't you changed your name since you converted to Christianity? I know Idris is a common name, but it's also strongly associated with Islam. Most converts would have chosen a new identity to reflect their faith. Idris nodded, encouraging her to proceed. Why do you choose to live so humbly, despite your wealth? You could live in luxury, drive flashy cars, and flaunt your success. But instead, you work quietly, help people in need, and avoid the spotlight.
Why?
Her final question came with a hint of curiosity and admiration. And why are you so focused on philanthropy? Most wealthy men chase more wealth, but you seem content giving it away. What's your motivation? Idris chuckled softly. You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you? Ngozi crossed her arms. I need to understand you before I can decide anything. Idris leaned forward, his gaze steady. I'll answer every single one of your questions, Ngozi. I'll even tell you the things you didn't think to ask. But on one condition. What condition? She asked, narrowing her eyes. You have to tell me about your past, he said simply. All of it. No walls, no defenses. If I'm going to share my truth, I need yours in return. Ngozi hesitated, her heart pounding. That's not fair, Idris. You're asking for something I'm not ready to give. And yet you expect me to bare my soul to you. He countered gently. Ngozi, I'm not asking for perfection. I just want honesty. If we're going to move forward, we both need to trust each other. Her defenses wavered, and she sighed.
Fine.
But you go first. Idris shook his head, smiling. No, you go first. You've promised me an answer before, and I've waited patiently. Once I hear your story, I'll give you mine and more. Ngozi frowned, weighing her options. She hated feeling cornered, but something in Idris's sincerity softened her resolve. "All right," she said quietly, "but if I tell you everything, I want your answers tonight. No more delays." Idris nodded. "You have my word." Ngozi sat in silence for a long moment, her hands gripping the hem of her blouse. She had spent years locking away the memories Idris now asked her to uncover. But his steady gaze and gentle presence gave her a strange sense of safety. "You want to know my story," she said softly, almost to herself.
Fine.
"But don't interrupt." Idris nodded, leaning forward to listen. "I wasn't always this guarded, you know," Ngozi began. "Once, I was a young woman full of dreams, eager to love and be loved. I met someone in my final year of university. His name was Kenneth." Her voice caught slightly at the name. "He was charming, ambitious, and deeply spiritual, or so I thought. We were inseparable, and I believed God had brought us together. We even started planning our future, marriage, a home, children. I trusted him completely." Idris didn't move, his expression solemn. "Kenneth proposed to me just after graduation. It was the happiest day of my life," she said with a sad smile. "I thought I had everything. But things changed quickly after we got engaged. He became distant, distracted, always finding reasons to delay the wedding." She paused, her voice trembling. "One day, I found out why. Kenneth was having an affair with my best friend, Chinyere." Idris's eyes widened in shock, but he stayed silent. "I confronted him, and he didn't even deny it," Ngozi continued, her voice hardening. "He told me he loved her, but didn't know how to tell me. Worse, he said he'd only because I was the ideal Christian wife, but she was the one he truly wanted." Ngozi's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Do you know how it feels to be told you're good enough for duty but not for love? To be betrayed by the two people you trusted most?" Idris shook his head, his throat tightening. "I broke off the engagement, of course," Ngozi said. "But the damage was done. Everyone in my church knew. My friends, my family, they all pitted me, and I hated it. I withdrew from everyone, even God. Myself into work, telling myself I didn't need love or anyone else." Her voice softened, tinged with bitterness. "But deep down, I've been running ever since. Running from the fear that it'll happen again. That if I let someone in, they'll find a way to hurt me, just like Kenneth did." She looked at Idris, her expression guarded. "So, there you have it. My story. Are you happy now?" For a moment, Idris couldn't speak. His chest ached with the weight of her pain. He had seen strength in Ngozi before, but now he understood the depth of her resilience and the scars that came with it. "Ngozi," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. No one deserves what you went through." She shrugged, trying to mask her vulnerability. "It's in the past. I've moved on." "No, you haven't," Idris said gently, his eyes glistening with tears. "You've built walls around your heart, and you've locked yourself inside. You're not free, Ngozi." Her lip trembled, but she quickly looked away. Idris reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. "I can't change what happened to you, but I can promise you this. I'll never betray you. I'll never take your love for granted. And I'll never stop fighting for your healing, even if you push me away." Ngozi's defenses cracked, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Why, Idris? Why would you care so much?" "Because I see you," he said simply. "And because I've been where you are, broken, betrayed, and afraid to trust again. But I've learned that healing doesn't come from hiding. It comes from letting the right people in." Ngozi didn't respond immediately, her emotions a swirling storm. But for the first time in years, she felt something shift, a tiny flicker of hope piercing through the walls she'd built. Finally, she met his gaze. "You still owe me answers, Idris. About your name, your choices, everything." Idris smiled through his own tears. "And you'll get them. But first, promise me something." "What?" she asked cautiously. "Promise me you'll let me walk this journey with you. Not as a condition for anything, but because you deserve to be free of the past." Ngozi hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try." It wasn't a full yes, but it was enough for Idris. Ngozi sat quietly, her heart still heavy from her own revelations. Idris watched her closely, sensing the vulnerability she had just exposed. He knew it was his turn now to answer her questions, to lay himself bare. He took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly. Ngozi, you've asked me some important questions, and I promised you the truth.
So here it is.
Idris smiled faintly. That's probably the question that's been bothering you the most. Ngozi nodded. Yes, it has. A man of your means doesn't need to get his hands dirty. So why did you? I went because I wanted to remind myself of where I came from, Idris began. I wasn't born wealthy, Ngozi. I grew up in a small house with 6 siblings and parents who worked tirelessly to provide for us. My father was a plumber, and I started helping him when I was just a boy. He paused, his gaze distant. Even after I built my company and became successful, I never wanted to forget the value of hard work or humility. When I take on small jobs like that, it grounds me. It reminds me of the people I serve and the kind of man I want to be. But why my house? Ngozi pressed. Idris hesitated, then smiled sheepishly. Because of you. I'd heard about you through some mutual acquaintances at church. When I saw your name on the work order, I decided to take it myself. I wanted to meet you, not as a CEO, but as someone real. I wanted to see how you treated someone you thought was ordinary. Ngozi blinked, her cheeks flushing slightly. You didn't disappoint, he added with a soft chuckle. You were kind, even if you were a little suspicious of me. Ngozi shifted in her seat, her curiosity deepening. And your name? Why didn't you choose a Christian one after your conversion? Idris nodded thoughtfully. When I became a Christian, I considered it. I even prayed about it. But the answer I received was clear. God didn't need me to change my name to prove my faith. My name, Idris, is part of my identity and my heritage. It's a reminder of where I've been and how far I've come. He smiled slightly. Besides, Idris means interpreter or teacher, and I believe God uses me in those roles every day. My name may have Islamic roots, but my life is a testimony to Christ. I decided it was more important to let my actions reflect my faith than to adopt a new label. Ngozi nodded slowly, her respect for him growing. Her next question was softer. You could live so differently, Idris. You've earned it. So, why do you choose this lifestyle? Idris's expression turned serious. Because wealth is a tool, not a purpose. I've seen how easily money can corrupt people, how it can make them forget what truly matters.
I don't want to be one of those people.
I live simply because it keeps me focused on the things that matter most. My faith, my relationships, and the work I'm called to do. He glanced at her. And, honestly, I've had my fair share of luxuries. They don't bring happiness. Giving back, helping others, living a life of purpose. That's what fulfills me. Ngozi tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. And your philanthropy? What drives it? Idris smiled warmly. I've been blessed, Ngozi. More than I ever imagined possible. I believe that blessings are meant to be shared, not hoarded. When I see someone in need, I think about the times when I needed help and someone stepped in for me. It's my way of paying it forward. He paused, his voice softening. But it's also personal. After Aina's betrayal, I realized I'd been so focused on building wealth that I'd neglected the things that really matter. Giving became my way of healing, of finding meaning again. When he finished, silence filled the room. Ngozi sat quietly, her heart swelling with admiration and something else she couldn't quite name. Thank you, she said finally, for being honest with me. Idris reached for her hand, his touch gentle. Thank you for trusting me with your story, too. Ngozi, I know you've been hurt, and I don't blame you for being cautious. But I want you to know that I'm here, not to fix you, but to walk with you through whatever comes next. Ngozi's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You're a remarkable man, Idris. And honestly, I don't know if I'm ready for what you're asking. But, she hesitated, then smiled faintly. I'm willing to try. Idris's face lit up, his relief palpable. That's all I ask. As Idris stepped out of Ngozi's house that night, the crisp air greeted him. The conversation they'd shared had left him both hopeful and reflective. But as he approached the gate, something unusual caught his eye, a small basket sitting just outside, covered with a soft blanket. "Idris, what is that?" Ngozi's voice came from behind him. She had followed him to the gate, her curiosity piqued by his pause. Idris crouched down and carefully pulled back the blanket. His breath hitched. Lying inside was a beautiful newborn baby girl, her tiny face serene, her hands clutching at the air as if reaching for something or someone. "Oh my God," Ngozi whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper that tugged at both their hearts. There was no note, no explanation. Only the child, abandoned to an uncertain fate. "What do we do?" Ngozi asked, her voice trembling. Idris sighed, his mind racing. "The first thing is to make sure she's safe. Let's take her to the nearest police station. They'll know what to do." Ngozi nodded, though her gaze lingered on the baby. "She's so beautiful," she murmured. They carefully picked up the basket and placed it in Idris's car. The drive to the station was silent, save for the baby's occasional coos. At the station, the officers listened to their account and examined the basket. "Well, it looks like she was abandoned," one of them said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "But we can't take her in right now. You'll have to keep her until we can investigate and decide the next steps." "Keep her?" Ngozi exclaimed.
But
"It's just temporary," the officer assured them. "A day or two, max. We'll call you with updates." Back in the car, Idris glanced at Ngozi. "So, what now?" "You'll have to take her," Ngozi said, biting her lip. "I have to be at the bank early tomorrow, and well, you have more flexibility." Idris nodded reluctantly.
fine.
"But I don't even have baby supplies." Ngozi hesitated. "I'll help you get everything you need." In fact, she trailed off, her mind racing. "I'll come with you to your house tonight. I want to make sure she's okay." Idris raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "It's late." "I'm sure," Ngozi said firmly. "Let's go." As they pulled up to Idris's mansion, Ngozi's jaw dropped. The sprawling estate, illuminated by soft outdoor lighting, looked like something out of a fairy tale. The manicured lawns, the grand fountain at the entrance, and the elegant architecture left her speechless. "I knew you were wealthy, but this," she whispered, unable to finish her sentence. Idris parked the car and smiled. "Come inside. You'll get used to it." Inside, the housemaids greeted them warmly, their faces lighting up when they saw the baby. "Oh, what a precious little angel," one of them exclaimed, taking the baby from Idris's arms with practiced ease. "We'll take care of her, sir," another assured him. "Don't worry." Ngozi watched as the staff seamlessly set up a makeshift nursery in one of the guest rooms. Their efficiency and care left her awestruck. For a moment, she felt like royalty, a feeling that was both humbling and overwhelming. That night, Ngozi lay awake in one of Idris's lavish guest rooms. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Was it the unexpected discovery of the baby that had her so shaken? Or the warmth of Idris's staff, who treated her as if she were already part of the family? Or was it the man himself? She replayed their evening conversation in her mind, remembering his honesty, his humility, and the deep sense of every